symbol for their deity is basically a square and a circle. All right? And in fact, for the Maya, a circle equals 13, and a square, or square-like shape, equals 20. And under Packel's rule, the 13-20 ratio was everywhere in Mayan culture. You couldn't get away from it. And when they found Packel's tomb and opened up the sarcophagus, they found his skeleton. And in his hands, he was holding two things. He was holding a ball, and he was holding a cube. All right? Now, I just said that for the Maya, a circle represents the number 13. That's because there's a real neat way of dividing a circle into 13 ways. There's a star. You can check them out. I can't do it. I'm not talented to do it freehand. A square represents 20. But Packel had three-dimensional objects in his hand. He had a cube and a ball. What he was pointing to was the higher dimensional aspects that the 1320 has inherent in it. We won't get too far out on you, but we'll talk about dimensions for a second. Did I ever tell you the one about the ball that broke into a square's room? You'll love this one. Okay. No, actually it's a story called Flatland. It was written in 1884 by a fellow named Edwin Abbott Abbott. And very ahead of his time for 1884, but it was a story about a hapless little square living in his two-dimensional world who one day encountered a three-dimensional object in his room, at night no less. And Abbott gives us some interesting things to think about, because remember, the square exists only in two dimensions. He only knows length and width. That's it. We live in a world where there is depth or volume. Okay, the difference between 2 and 3 dimensions. Square is in 2 dimensions, and all he has is this and that. Whatever the surface of a piece of paper is what the square exists on. So when this 3-dimensional object comes to visit him, he first sees it just as a dot, because if you'll imagine, as the 3-dimensional object is passing through the 2-dimensional plane, the first point that touches it would look like a dot. And then as it moves through, it started to look like a series of larger and larger and larger circles, but without all the little ones I drew inside. Right? And so he sees this ball as a small dot becoming a circle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it reaches the full diameter, continues passing, and now the circle starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller until it fades away. Totally mysterious to Mr. Square. He has no idea where it came from. Didn't come from any of the directions he's used to. It just appeared, got big, got small, went away. Well, the sphere decided to have a little fun with him and started telling him things like, you know, well, I can see in your other room, let's say this is Mr. Square's other room, and let's say these are his personal belongings. The sphere standing out here said, you know, I can see in your room, and I can see everything you have in your room. Mr. Square says, no, you can't. There's a wall there. How can you see what I've got in there? The sphere says, well, because I'm standing above you. Remember, he didn't know what above is. So, Mr. Sphere takes Mr. Square and pulls him up to the 3rd dimension. And what a time Mr. Square has experiencing reality as a cube. Because he suddenly understands what he could not understand down here in 2 dimensions. Volume, depth. Everything has that. So, I use that to illustrate the idea of higher dimensional, hyperdimensional, multidimensional, pick your term, views of reality. And unfortunately, what happened to Mr. Square is what has happened to most people throughout history who have taken any kind of view of reality other than the normal one, and that was that he came back from his experience as a cube to all his friends in Square World and told them how wonderful this land of volume was and what great wonders and how you could see things that you could never see before. And he was tried and locked away in a mental institution for the rest of his life. That'll teach you to think outside the box, right? Okay. So, let's get back to Packle real quick, and we'll wrap up and go to break. So there we find Packle. He's got two three-dimensional objects in his hand, okay, representing 1320, but he's saying this means that there are other dimensions available. This 1320 talks about not just linear time, we're talking about higher dimensions, the place where the gods live. And what are we talking about for us? The fourth dimension? What is the fourth dimension? Well, it's every direction. And this is real simple. You don't even need your pens to write this down. If you haven't heard this before, I'm going to give it to you. It's the secret. The fourth dimension is every direction that you can't see. Right? Somewhere. Every direction you can't see, that's the fourth dimension. Just like for two dimensions, the third dimension, he can't see. It's outside of his perception. We can understand things about the fourth dimension by playing games like this with two dimensions and thinking about our own dimension, so we can imagine these kinds of things. And that's all that this tool is used for. But what Packle is pointing to is that there's a transcendent quality to this time and to their understanding of God that moves beyond mere linear or the measure of days, backtunes, catunes, or kin, or years. And we're talking about how does consciousness develop. So, before we get into the 9 levels of their consciousness, I'll finish up with an interesting prophecy that Packle left us. I said Maya were fascinated with the 1320, and they were, and so was Packle. Not only in his tomb, but his burial itself was a prophecy for the future. You see, Packle died in 683, but he was not entombed for 9 more years to represent the 9 levels of creation that the Maya believed were existent. From the time of his sealing of the tomb, which was right down here, in 683, to its opening. And remember, they had found in 1948 the Temple of Inscriptions and this tube that led all the way down 63 feet. But it took them 4 years of excavation to get to what turned out to be Packle's tomb. And that year was 1952. The period of time that had elapsed between 683 and 1952 was exactly 1,260 years. 1260. This was Packle's message to those that were to find him, because he knew exactly when his tomb was to be found, which was exactly why he made them wait 9 years to put him in it. It was a message. For those that find me in this time, that is the last back tune of the 13 in this long count. That's this time right here. He said, when you find it, I'm leaving you a message that you're living under a false concept of time. Now, because Packle was a nice guy, he didn't just leave us with a problem or point out a problem. He hinted at a solution, and it was this. And it works kind of two ways. If you look at the number of years between 1952 and the closing of the cycle of the long count in 2012, that is 60 years. Or, if you look at the amount of time that elapses, I'm sorry, this is 692. 692. That's when he was in his tomb. 692. The amount of time from 692, when he was put in his tomb, until the end of the cycle is 1,320 years. 60 years from the day it was discovered, and 1,320 from when it was sealed. Haeckel's prophecy and message to mankind was pay attention to your time. And speaking of time, this